The Man from Andersonville by Brad Ward. His vengeance trail led him from the deep South to the Wild West. Andersonville was a name no man who wore the Union blue could ever forget, especially those who had been prisoners in the filth and cruelty of that grim death camp. Hart Caven was one of those men, and he carried a hate in his heart so deep and so violent that he was driven by only one thing: revenge. Revenge for the death of his kid brother, a meaningless death at the hands of 3 torturers. The bitter, somber man, who could throw a knife faster than any man around, had to kill these 3 before he could rest. But first, the man from Andersonville had to scour the Wild West to find them. The dream was always the same: a boy's face, twisted with agony, his pale blue eyes begging for help that could not be given, his bone-thin hands clutching harshly at the man who held him in his arms, his tortured voice crying out, "Help me! Hart, don't let me die. I'm afraid, Hart, so afraid." And as always after the dream, Hart Caven awakened with his thin body shaking, his hands balled into fists so tightly the tendons in his forearms ached. The vision of the boy's face held steady for a moment, then faded into the blur of memory, and Hart was fully conscious. He heard the rattling clamor of the freight train, the high-pitched squealing of brakes, and then felt the forward jolting of his body as the trail slowed abruptly. The nightmare of Andersonville prison and the memory of his brother seemed stronger tonight, harder to force back into the unreality of memory. One dirt-grimed hand came up before the huddled man's blue-hued eyes, and his lips whispered a name: Davy. Then he shook his head and shrugged his shoulders to ease the ache in them. The interior of the wooden boxcar was dark, but outside the open sliding doors he saw the rain-blurred flash of a light of a signal lamp. Far ahead, the whistle of the locomotive keyed wellingly. The train was coming into a freight yard. Hart climbed warily to his feet, his half-starved body protesting at every movement, and crossed to the open door. He watched the odd pattern of the yard lights and felt the cold wetness of rain whip into his face. He shivered against the bite of the cold wind, and drew his tattered coat closer about him. In the sudden flaring light of a red lantern, his face was lean, the white mark of a scar standing out across his forehead. His left hand made the unconscious gesture of passing before his eyes again as he turned away from the open door and returned to the dark interior of the freight car. He groped blindly for his bedroll, found it, and swung it across his shoulders by the rope that bound it. He returned to the open door and leaned against one side, staring out into the dark, rain-lashed night. The train lurched and slowed again. The shrilling whistle cut through the rattling din of the steel wheels. The railroad police would shake down the freight train as it came into the yards. Hart did not relish the thought of being caught. In the turbulent surge of industry that had followed the Civil War, there was no room, no consideration for those who had lost their way, or maybe only for those who would not forget their hate and anger. Hart knew him at once, the bandit that Lou Winters had identified as Curly. The man's wide grin held for a moment, but his eyes were vicious. "Stay out of my way." The man behind Curly was slight of build, narrow of face. He was clean-shaven, an oddity in this land of bearded men, and his skin was pasty white. He was laughing in silent enjoyment of Hart's discomfiture as they rode up the street. Hart got up and carefully dusted himself off. His eyes followed the 2 men as they rode into Thunder Rock, and narrowed as he saw them pull up in front of a saloon and dismount. Hart's mouth settled in a thin smile, and he returned to the road and walked slowly on. The two horses were tethered to the tie rail in front of the Long Tom saloon, and he paused before it. He held there a moment, his face hard and intent. Then he turned in. The big room sweltered under the heat of the sun, pouring through dingy gray canvas, and despite the fact that the walls were rolled up, no breath of air fanned the greasy tobacco smoke that held in a turbulent pall overhead. Men were lined up at the bar, 3 deep, but Hart's intent gaze caught Curly and his partner, an open space on either side of them. Hart started for them, then halted as a big, raw-boned man stepped in front of him. The man's bluff, open face was smiling. "They're poison, mister," he said softly. "They're poison, mister," he said softly. His eyes flickered towards Curly and his companion. Then he moved on as if he had not paused at all. Hart held still a moment longer, then walked to the bar to stand beside Curly. The bandit was a big man. His shoulders were wide and thick, and his heavy corded beard stood up redly above the open collar of his flannel shirt. A thin rime of dirt stood around the fringes of his beard, across the redness of his neck. The right hand lay across the bar, gripping the glass of whiskey. The bone handles of his navy coat were thrust up and slightly forward.